My name is Carlos, and I'm 53. I've lived in Austin, Texas, my whole life, and I've worked hard for everything I have. I started out as a contractor in home renovations years ago, building up my own business from scratch. Now, it's well known locally. People trust me to get things done right, and I'm proud of that. I've got a simple lifestyle: work hard, take care of my family, and try to keep things steady. That's been my way for as long as I can remember. Beth, my wife, is 45. She's a yoga instructor, and she's been putting more and more into her career over the last few years. We've been married a long time, but recently it feels like she's slipping away. She's become distant, putting less time into our marriage and more into herself. It's not like she used to be. I didn't mind her focus on yoga at first. Who doesn't want their partner to take care of themselves? But now, it feels like she's more interested in her career, her body, and how she looks than in me or our family. We've got a son, Bob, who's 21 and in college. He lives with us but is rarely around. He's got his friends, his studies, and his life going on, which means it's mostly just Beth and me in the house these days. It's quiet in our suburban home, tucked away on the outskirts of Austin, near the Barton Creek Greenbelt. The kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But there's this tension, simmering under the surface. It's been like that for a while, and I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong, even if I've been trying to ignore it. Beth's changed in more ways than one. She's more focused on her appearance, going to the gym, staying late after yoga classes, always busy with something. Meanwhile, I've stayed the same, still the same guy who built this life for us. I've kept things simple, always thinking that was enough. But lately, I've felt like I'm the only one holding on. Our relationship used to be solid, but now, it's like there's a wall between us. I trust her, or at least, I thought I did. I never saw any reason not to, even though I've noticed the emotional distance between us. But I kept telling myself that marriages go through phases. You can't expect everything to stay the same, right? We've had our ups and downs, like anyone. But I always thought we'd pull through. Then, one evening, I came home from a long day of work. I'd been on site all day, dealing with a big renovation project that needed my attention. The house was quiet, as usual. Bob was out with his friends, and Beth was supposed to be at her yoga class. I walked into the hallway, tossed my keys onto the table, and that's when I noticed it. Beth's phone, just sitting there on the table. Normally, she never leaves it lying around like that. I don't know why, but a weird feeling washed over me when I saw it. I've never been one to check her phone. We've always respected each other's privacy. But something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the silence in the house, or maybe it was something deeper. Whatever it was, I picked up her phone. There was a message notification on the screen. From someone named Neil. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, Beth works with a lot of people at the gym. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the message. The words on the screen hit me like a punch to the gut. The message was flirtatious, way too intimate to be anything normal. And it didn't stop there. I scrolled through the conversation, and the more I saw, the worse it got. There were explicit messages, pictures, and conversations spanning months. Beth wasn't just having an affair, she had feelings for this guy. Neil. A 25-year-old trainer at the gym where she teaches. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My wife, the woman I've spent over 20 years with, had been lying to me for months. She wasn't just cheating physically, she was emotionally involved with this guy. That hurt the most. I didn't confront her that night. I wasn't ready. I needed to process what I'd just discovered. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I confront her right away? Should I let it slide and hope it goes away? But deep down, I knew there was no going back from this. The first thing I did was start gathering evidence. I wanted to be sure, though the texts and photos were more than enough. I hired a private investigator to track her, follow her movements, and get me proof that I could use if it came to that. Over the next week, the investigator confirmed what I already knew: Beth was seeing Neil regularly, sneaking around behind my back. After discovering the texts, I spent the next few days in a fog. Every time I looked at Beth, I felt this sharp sting of betrayal. She went about her usual routine, coming home from yoga, going out for what she said were meetings with clients or gym friends, but I knew the truth now. Neil, this younger guy, had crept into our lives, and Beth let it happen. The woman I thought I knew was living a double life, and I had to pretend everything was normal while the truth gnawed at me from the inside. I needed time to figure out my next move. Blowing up in anger and confronting her right away wouldn't do any good, and I knew that. I needed a plan, something that would hit her where it hurt. So, instead of reacting, I started to play my part. I was going to make sure she paid for every lie, every deceitful moment. That's when the first bit of luck fell into my lap. Beth came home one day looking unusually upset, her usual confident air gone. I could tell something had happened, but I didn't ask. She sat down at the kitchen table, and after a few minutes of silence, she finally spoke. "The studio's closing down," she said, her voice low. "It's a mess, they mismanaged everything, and now I'm out of a job." The yoga studio where she worked had gone under, and now she was scrambling, unsure of what to do next. I could see the panic starting to rise in her. She depended on that job, not just for money but for her sense of identity. I played it cool, gave her a sympathetic nod, but inside, I saw the opportunity. Beth had mentioned in her messages that Neil had promised to help her get some clients at the gym where he worked. That gym was now her lifeline, and she was leaning on Neil, both emotionally and financially. It wasn't just an affair anymore, it was something more, something that tied her to him in ways she probably hadn't planned for. Neil, the young hotshot, was going to help her start over. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Through my connections in the construction industry, I started spreading some rumors about Neil's gym, building code violations, unsafe practices, things that would catch the attention of the right people. I knew how to make it seem like the gym was under scrutiny without drawing direct attention to myself. Small whispers in the right ears go a long way, especially in a town like Austin. It didn't take long for those whispers to turn into real problems for Neil and his gym. Inspections were suddenly happening more often, clients were starting to get nervous, and soon enough, Neil's perfect little world was starting to crack. It was the beginning of what I had in mind, a slow, painful collapse for the man who thought he could take what was mine. As Neil struggled to keep things afloat, Beth's situation grew worse. Without the studio, she was trying to piece together freelance yoga work, but it wasn't going well. Her financial situation, once stable, was starting to unravel. She didn't realize that I had already started quietly moving money out of our joint accounts, into accounts that were under my name alone. I made sure she didn't notice at first, letting her think everything was fine. I even stopped paying her credit card bills, letting the debt pile up without her realizing it. She was distracted, so caught up in her affair with Neil and her sudden joblessness that she wasn't paying attention to the little things, like the fact that her bank balance was lower than it should be, or that her credit score was slowly tanking. It was all part of the plan. And it was working. Beth started leaning harder on Neil, expecting him to be the answer to her problems. But the more pressure she put on him, the more their little affair began to fray. What started as an exciting, forbidden romance was turning into a source of stress and anxiety. Neil wasn't prepared to carry Beth financially, and with his gym under fire, he was losing his grip on the situation too. It was almost perfect. I watched from the sidelines as the cracks in their relationship began to show. Beth was still coming home, still pretending like everything was fine between us, but I could see it in her eyes. She was starting to feel the weight of everything coming down on her. The financial pressure, the stress of the gym failing, and the realization that Neil wasn't the savior she thought he was. She didn't suspect that I was behind any of it. Not yet, anyway. I wasn't done, though. This was only the beginning of what I had planned. Watching Beth and Neil squirm was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. I wanted to make sure that when this was all over, Beth wouldn't just lose Neil, she'd lose everything. And I was getting closer to that goal every day. The tension between us had grown thicker, but I kept my calm, biding my time. Beth, oblivious to my plans, was still wrapped up in her little world with Neil. I could tell she was struggling, but she didn't want to admit it to me. The financial strain, the pressure of losing her job, it was all starting to weigh her down. And I was just getting started. As the days passed, our son, Bob, began to sense that something was off. He wasn't home much, always busy with friends in college, but he'd picked up on the tension between Beth and me. Our conversations were strained, the silence heavier than it used to be. Beth's usual lightness had disappeared, and I could tell Bob was starting to notice. It all came to a head one weekend when Neil came by the house under the pretense of fixing something in the garage. I wasn't there at the time, but Bob was. He overheard bits of their conversation, enough to know that Neil wasn't just some guy helping out. When I came home later that night, Bob was unusually quiet. At dinner, he barely said a word, his eyes flicking between Beth and me, trying to read the situation. After Beth went to bed, Bob finally spoke up. He walked into the living room, where I was sitting with the TV on but barely paying attention. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I turned the volume down and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "With you and Mom. Is everything okay?" I paused for a moment, considering what to say. Bob had always been different from me, more sensitive, more of a peacemaker. If I told him everything, I knew he'd want to fix it, to try and reconcile us. That's just how he was. But I didn't want reconciliation, and I couldn't afford for him to get in the way of what I had planned. I had to keep him at a distance, at least for now. "Your mom's been making some decisions that have hurt the family," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But it's not something you need to worry about." Bob frowned. "What kind of decisions?" I could see the concern in his eyes, and part of me hated keeping him in the dark. But I knew that if he tried to mediate between us, it would complicate everything. He wasn't like me, he believed that problems could be solved by talking, by finding common ground. That wasn't the case here. Beth had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. "Just some bad choices," I replied, my voice steady. "But we'll handle it. It's between your mom and me." Bob nodded, but he didn't seem satisfied with my answer. He was trying to make sense of the situation, but I wasn't about to give him the full picture. Not yet. The last thing I needed was for him to confront Beth or, worse, to try and play the role of mediator. He loved his mom, and I knew that deep down, he'd want to believe there was a way to fix things. But I wasn't interested in fixing anything. I watched as he processed my words, his face tightening. He didn't ask any more questions that night, but I could tell he was starting to pull away from Beth, sensing that something was deeply wrong. He wasn't angry with her, not yet, but the trust he'd always had in his mother was beginning to fray. In the days that followed, Bob grew more distant, especially with Beth. He didn't outright avoid her, but the closeness they once shared seemed to evaporate. I could see it in the way he spoke to her, short and guarded, like he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Beth, caught up in her own problems, didn't seem to notice. For now, it was enough. I had successfully planted doubt in Bob's mind without revealing the full truth. I needed him to stay on my side, or at the very least, not on hers. The more distance there was between him and Beth, the easier it would be for me to finish what I'd started. Beth and Neil's relationship continued to sour, and Beth started coming home with a mix of frustration and stress that she tried to hide but couldn't quite keep bottled up. She mentioned things in passing, issues at work, financial worries, but she kept her explanations vague. The confident woman who once dominated the yoga studio was slipping, and though she hadn't fully broken yet, I knew it wouldn't be long. I could see her unraveling bit by bit, but I kept my distance, pretending not to notice. I let her stew in the mess she had created, silently waiting for the right moment to make my next move. But as much as Beth was preoccupied with her own problems, I had another concern, Bob. He was sharper than I'd given him credit for, and his questions were becoming more pointed. He hadn't confronted his mother yet, but he was on the verge of digging deeper. I had to keep him at arm's length, which wasn't easy. As much as I didn't want him involved, I knew Bob had a good heart. He'd try to fix things if he got too close. And that was the last thing I wanted. So, I kept things vague. I offered just enough explanation to satisfy his curiosity without giving him any real answers. And for now, that was enough to keep him from prying too much. But I knew the clock was ticking. Bob wouldn't stay in the dark forever, and I needed to be ready for when he finally pieced it all together. For now, though, things were still moving in the direction I wanted. Bob was drifting away from Beth, just as I had hoped. And as for Beth, she was slowly but surely realizing that the life she had been trying to hold on to was slipping through her fingers. With each passing day, the distance between Beth and Bob widened. She hadn't noticed, but I had. It wasn't long before the balance of our family would shift entirely, and when that happened, I would be ready. It was late one evening, after another quiet dinner. Beth had already gone upstairs, probably texting Neil or worrying about the latest drama in her crumbling life, and Bob and I were left in the living room, the tension between us thick. He was sitting across from me, staring at the TV but not really watching. I could feel him building up to something, and after a long silence, he finally spoke. "Dad," he said quietly, "I know what's going on." I didn't react at first. I'd been waiting for this, but I hadn't expected him to come right out and say it. I turned the volume down, glanced over at him, and said, "What do you mean, Bob?" He shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable but determined. "When I asked you what was wrong with Mom, you said she'd made some bad decisions. I didn't push you then, but I knew what you were talking about." I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't want him involved in this, didn't want him getting caught in the crossfire of what was happening between Beth and me. But there was no turning back now. "I overheard Mom and Neil," Bob continued, his voice steady but tense. "In the garage. I didn't hear everything, but it was enough. I've known for a while now, but I didn't know what to do." I stayed silent, letting him get it all out. Bob was looking at me now, his face a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I wanted to do something," he admitted. "To talk to you, or to her. But I knew you wouldn't listen to me. I could see it in the way you looked at me when I asked if everything was okay. You were keeping me out of it for a reason." I nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't want you involved in this." "Why not?" Bob asked, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not a kid anymore. I could have helped." "That's exactly why," I said. "You would have tried to help. Tried to fix things. And that's not what I wanted." Bob looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to fix anything, Bob. There's no fixing this. Your mother made her choice, and I've made mine." He stared at me, stunned for a moment, trying to process what I was saying. "You don't want to even try? You don't want to work things out?" "No," I said firmly. "This isn't something that can be worked out. Your mom crossed a line, and there's no going back from that." Bob sat back, clearly struggling with what I was telling him. "But, she's still Mom," he said quietly. "She's still your mother, yes," I replied, my voice softer now. "And I'll never try to change that. You can love her, you can care for her, but that doesn't change what she's done." He didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there, staring at the floor. I could see the conflict in him, the part of him that wanted to believe there was a way to put this back together, even though deep down, he knew there wasn't. "I didn't want to believe it," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I knew. I knew the second you said she'd made bad decisions. I just didn't want to face it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say." Bob had figured it out on his own, but that didn't make it any easier for him. He was stuck between his parents, both of us pulling him in different directions without meaning to. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" "For not doing anything," he replied. "I wanted to, but I knew you wouldn't want me to get involved." "You did the right thing, Bob," I said, leaning forward. "There's nothing you could have done. This isn't your fight. It's between your mom and me." Bob nodded slowly, but I could tell it didn't make him feel any better. He was torn, just like I knew he would be. And as much as I hated putting him in that position, I needed him to stay out of it. I needed him on the sidelines, away from the mess that Beth and I were in. While Bob wrestled with his emotions, Beth was completely oblivious. She didn't notice the growing distance between her and our son. She was too wrapped up in her own problems, Neil, the gym, her finances. It was all coming down on her, but she still hadn't fully realized just how bad things had gotten. She mentioned in passing one night that Neil's gym was in trouble. "He's losing clients," she said, trying to sound casual. "I don't know what's going on, but it's affecting his business." I nodded, hiding my satisfaction. I didn't need to ask her for details, I already knew. The rumors I'd spread about building code violations were working. Neil's gym was under constant scrutiny, and he was struggling to keep it together. That was part of the plan. Slowly, methodically, I was making sure both of them felt the pressure. But as satisfying as it was to watch Neil's business fall apart, my focus remained on Beth. I'd started moving money out of our joint accounts, draining funds from our savings without her noticing. She was so distracted by her own problems that she hadn't even realized the financial trouble she was in. Her credit cards were maxing out, her bills were piling up, and she was barely holding it together. I watched her flounder, waiting for the right moment to reveal just how deep of a hole she was in. One night, not long after my conversation with Bob, I made my move. I'd been planning this for weeks, quietly gathering evidence of Beth's affair, draining our joint finances, and watching as her world slowly crumbled. Now it was time to confront her. I waited until Bob had gone out for the evening, not wanting him to be around for what was about to happen. Beth was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, probably texting Neil again. I walked in and sat down at the table across from her. "We need to talk," I said. She glanced up, surprised by the seriousness in my voice. "What about?" "About Neil," I said, watching her face carefully. Her expression changed instantly. She froze, her eyes wide, as the realization sank in. What are you talking about?" "I know everything," I said, my voice cold. "The texts. The photos. The meetings. I've known for a while." Beth stared at me, speechless, her face draining of color. She didn't try to deny it. She knew she was caught. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping, filled with the evidence I'd gathered over the past few weeks. I slid it across the table toward her. "Here's all the proof," I said calmly. "Everything you've done." Beth opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the pages, her face growing paler with each passing second. I watched her, feeling a cold satisfaction as she realized just how much I knew. "I also know about the money," I continued. "Our joint accounts are almost empty, and your credit cards are maxed out. You didn't even notice, did you?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Carlos, Save it," I interrupted. "I don't want to hear your excuses." She broke down, sobbing at the table, but it didn't move me. I'd spent too long watching her lie to my face, too long planning this moment. I stood up and placed the divorce papers in front of her. "You're going to sign these," I said, my voice steady. "And when you do, you'll be left with nothing. No money, no house, nothing." Beth's sobs turned into quiet whimpers as she stared down at the papers. I walked away, leaving her at the table, knowing that her world had just shattered. And there was nothing she could do to fix it. As I walked upstairs, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The days after I confronted Beth were eerily quiet. She had been avoiding me, barely speaking, still reeling from the shock of what I'd laid out in front of her. The divorce papers were sitting on the kitchen table, waiting for her signature. I wasn't in a rush. She could take her time realizing there was no way out of this mess. I had expected some sort of fight from her, some last-ditch effort to defend herself, but nothing came. Maybe she knew deep down that any argument would be pointless. I had caught her in the act, there was no room left for denial. The damage had already been done. Bob, who had been keeping his distance after our conversation, finally approached me again a few days later. He'd clearly been thinking about everything for a while, processing the whole situation, and now he was ready to talk. I was sitting in the living room when he came in, looking more composed than he had before. He sat down across from me, his expression calm but serious. "I guess it's over now," Bob said quietly. I nodded. "All that's left is for her to sign the divorce papers." Bob stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I'm surprised she didn't suspect you knew," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, I noticed something was off weeks ago. You'd think she would have picked up on it." I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. "She was too wrapped up in the affair," I replied. "She thought she had everything under control, I guess." "Yeah," Bob said, nodding slowly. "She must have had this going on for a long time to get that comfortable." He wasn't wrong. Beth had been living in this fantasy world for months, maybe even longer. She had gotten sloppy, too relaxed, thinking she could keep everything hidden. I could see now how she had let herself slip, believing she could juggle it all without me noticing. But I had noticed. I'd seen the signs, even if I hadn't acted right away. And when I did, it was already too late for her to realize how deep in trouble she was. "It probably started long before you figured it out," Bob added, his voice quiet. "She was so sure of herself, so comfortable sneaking around. She must have thought you'd never find out." "Maybe," I said. "But it doesn't matter now. What's done is done." Bob fell silent again, processing the weight of everything. I knew this wasn't easy for him. His mother had always been a big part of his life, and now she had become the source of all this pain. Later that evening, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the divorce papers still lying on the table. Beth hadn't touched them. She hadn't even brought them up since I had handed them to her. I wasn't surprised, she was probably still in shock, trying to process how everything had crumbled so quickly. Beth came downstairs quietly, her face pale, eyes red from crying. She glanced at me, then at the papers, but didn't say a word. You going to sign them? I asked, my tone neutral. She hesitated, then nodded weakly. I will, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need time. I didn't say anything. I knew she was dragging it out, holding on to whatever last shred of control she thought she had. But in the end, it didn't matter how long she took. The outcome was inevitable. Beth stood there for a moment longer, looking like she wanted to say something, but no words came. Finally, she turned and walked away, retreating upstairs again, leaving the papers untouched. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. It didn't matter. She could take as long as she wanted, but nothing was going to change. A few days passed after our last conversation, and Beth finally signed the divorce papers. She didn't say much when she did it, just quietly placed the papers on the kitchen table and walked away. There were no arguments, no tears this time. Just a resigned silence as she accepted that this was the end. After everything that had happened, she knew she had no other choice. She was going to leave Austin after the divorce, move to San Antonio to stay with her cousin for a while. That had always been her plan if things ever fell apart, and now it was happening. As for me, I had no intention of telling anyone about what had happened between Beth and me. My relatives, my friends, they started asking questions, wondering why I had become more withdrawn, why I looked a little gloomier these days. They could sense something had changed, but I kept my mouth shut. I wasn't interested in airing out our dirty laundry to anyone. If they found out about the affair from Beth, or through her parents, so be it. But I wasn't going to be the one to spread the news. There was something about keeping it private that felt right. It wasn't about pride, it was just that some things didn't need to be discussed with everyone. Besides, there were other things that needed my attention now. For months, I'd been pouring all my energy into dealing with Beth, tracking her affair, setting things in motion for the divorce. I had let my business take a back seat during that time, and it showed. I was a contractor, after all, and my work had always been my source of stability. It was time to get back to it. I started refocusing on my company, diving back into the renovation projects that had been piling up while I was distracted. It felt good, like a part of me was returning to normal. There was still a lot to process emotionally, but keeping busy was the best way to deal with it. One afternoon, after a long day on a job site, I drove through the Central District, a part of town I didn't usually frequent. It was a lively area, filled with restaurants, cafes, and people enjoying the sun on outdoor terraces. As I passed by one of the restaurants, I spotted him. Neil. He was working there, running around like a waiter, bringing food out to the customers sitting on the summer terrace. I watched him for a moment, unnoticed, as he rushed back and forth, sweating under the afternoon sun. It was almost surreal seeing him like that. Not so long ago, he was the young, cocky guy who had stolen my wife. Now, here he was, just another guy working a restaurant job, hustling to keep his head above water. I have to admit that I didn't feel any real satisfaction seeing him like that, just a kind of cold indifference. Life was starting to settle into a new rhythm. Beth was gone, and the house was quieter, but not uncomfortably so. Bob was still living at home, but we didn't talk much about Beth. He called her about twice a week at first, checking in on her in San Antonio. Then, the calls slowed down to once a week. He told me a couple of times that he wanted to visit her there, but for now, those were just words. I didn't push him either way. Bob had also been keeping himself busy with school. Just recently, he had won an opportunity to do an internship at UConn Waterbury. He'd be leaving in 2 weeks to head up to Connecticut for the program. I was proud of him. It would give him some space to process everything without the weight of the situation hanging over him. As for me, there was still a lot to sort out, financially, emotionally. That was enough for now. And as for the rest? It would come in time.